You have a handout. I'll work off of that handout primarily today. It's a kind of a version of some things I've been doing. For Chris, I know he's heard it as county president now a couple of times. But what I talk about, I'm going to kind of give you an overview of where we are politically, both on the state and federal level. Talk a little bit about some of our regulatory issues, and then talk a little bit about what does the election maybe hold for us in agriculture. And it remains to be seen, again, who's the winner, if you will, of that election. But we'll talk about sort of the scenario that's out here and what agriculture has at stake on the table. So let me start with the national scenario, and if you want to follow along, I think it's actually at the top of the second page. We'll talk about the GMO labeling bill. This is one of the successes, one of the good newses, if you will. Somebody asked me here over lunch if I had any good news to tell you, and I said, well, I have a little bit, but I don't have a lot. But I do want to talk about the GMO bill because that is, in my opinion, a very big victory for us in agriculture. And I know it was not a perfect bill, and we'll talk a little bit here in a minute about kind of what the aspects of the bill are. But here's the biggest victory in my mind for us getting a national GMO labeling bill. It avoids us having a patchwork of state-by-state issues regarding GMO labeling. The other issue out here on the national level that I want to talk about is trade. Trade, unfortunately, has really gotten a black eye because of the campaign. Both sides of the aisle are very negative on trade, in particular the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a critical agreement for agriculture. It's really a critical agreement even beyond trade issues. If you're following at all what's going on in the South China Sea right now, and you're watching this kind of from a bigger picture standpoint in terms of security and global security, global peace, this has a lot of ramifications. And again, unfortunately, both sides have beat up trade quite a bit, extensively. So we at Illinois Farm Bureau, along with the American Farm Bureau Federation, will continue this push for trade. If you were at the Illinois State Fair on Ag Day, we were fortunate to have several members of our congressional delegation there. Congressman Davis, Congressman Boss, Congressman Shimkus, and then Congresswoman Bustos, and Congressman LaHood. It's not often that you get that many members of Congress together. Senator Kirk was also there in attendance that morning. So it was a great opportunity for the ag community to talk, not only about trade, but several other ag issues. The other thing out here that I want to touch on the national level is the 2018 Farm Bill. I was in Washington a few weeks ago, and as I mentioned to a few folks earlier, I was really surprised how much discussion and how much positioning is already taking place around the 2018 bill. If you recall back to us trying to get the last Farm Bill done, it was a very laborious process. It took a lot longer than it should have. We were very late in getting it done. Finally, Speaker Boehner was able to move his delegation in caucus to get something done, and we did get a bill. But we waited, and we kind of were mirrored down, if you will, in terms of getting that done. If you shift over to the state side, again, I've been saying this, I think, every year I come out and do a Toolshed meeting. Our big issue still remains fiscal. It still remains the budget. And as you know, there was a stopgap budget passed back in July. Stopgap, I guess, is a good word for it, Band-Aid, whatever you want to call it. It's very much a short-term budget. It does not in any way, shape, or form address the issues that we have in front of us as far as pension, debt, unpaid bills, all those sorts of things that just keep growing and growing and growing. So after the election in November, in the fall veto session for the General Assembly, you will start to, I think, hear sort of what are each side thinking in terms of how they move forward with this budget and with this fiscal area. We will come back after the election, and again, the leadership in the General Assembly is going to have to decide how do we move forward from here. As I've told the IA Board of Directors, one of the things that undoubtedly is going to come up is revenue. They will have to find additional revenue. What's that mean for us? Well, probably some kind of a tax increase in the income tax sector. I don't know to what percentage. But the other thing that we are watching very closely is our sales tax exemption on our agricultural inputs, and our farmland assessment law. Those are two things that, in my opinion, Illinois agriculture must maintain. The amendment would be put on the ballot in November, and it would be a constitutional amendment to allow a bipartisan independent committee to draw the legislative maps rather than the party that's in power. That is now hung up in the courts. It's been challenged because of constitutionality, primarily by the Speaker, because he obviously does not want to lose the ability to retain control of drawing the maps. And we anticipate, hopefully, we'll have a decision this week on that from the higher courts. But it's an example, in my opinion, of, again, trying to keep a power base and not lose it. And that's one way to do it. That particular amendment would probably, if it were to pass by the voters, would allow us to address, in my opinion, several issues in Springfield that have been a problem for a long time. One of those is the telecommunications bill. Some of you participated in a call to action on that bill. We felt very strongly that we had to be engaged in that bill in terms of the property rights issue that was sort of at stake there in terms of how those telecommunication companies either were or were not working with the landowners. So that bill is still out there. It did not move through. It was kind of held up at in terms of committee and so forth. But it is still definitely there. And the other thing that's out here that I think will become a big issue, and I understand there's some members of the county board here, so this would be of particular interest to you, is the issue of the Livestock Management Facilities Act. Okay? If you saw a couple of weeks ago, there was a 4-part series in the Chicago Tribune on pork production in Illinois. Very, very disparaging series of articles. In my opinion, a very unfair series of articles and a very inaccurate series of articles that really tried to represent all the wrong things and really never talked about all the right things, of which 99.9% of them are right. The issue here that's going to happen out of these articles is the fact that they have already, the Illinois Environmental Council, the Sierra Club, they already have a call to action out to legislators to amend the LMFA. And one of the issues in the LMFA that they want changed is the issue of local control. They want counties to have the right to say yes or no to these facilities, either creating one from scratch or remodeling, expanding, whatever. And if you get into, just like we talked about the GMO issue, if you get into a patchwork of county by county, you're going to have a real hodgepodge in this state of different rules and regulations that I think will be, in many ways, it'll be the end of the livestock industry as we know it in Illinois, which is ultimately the goal of many of the activist groups and even some of the environmental groups. In my opinion, it isn't as much about environmental issues as it is, again, an anti-livestock agenda, an anti-meat agenda, those sorts of things. Speaking of regulatory issues, just kind of segue over to that down there at the bottom of page 4 and at the top of page 5. One of the things, and this is really primarily more on the federal level, but one of the things, regardless of who's elected as our president, we anticipate putting a lot of emphasis and focus on regulatory reform as we enter into the next session of Congress. And there are a number of issues listed there that have to do with working with the U.S. EPA and some of the practices that they're sort of using, such as sue and settle, and different things in terms of congressional oversight. So we are going to make sure that we prioritize a couple of these issues as we move forward into the next Congress. One of those things, the guys are passing around here a postcard that I would respectfully ask you to sign if you're so inclined regarding the use of atrazine. It is now under comment period and up for review from an ecological usage standpoint. There's some assessment by U.S. EPA that atrazine is harmful to the environment, harmful to the ecology. If you would be so inclined, we'd like to send these cards back to encourage U.S. EPA in this comment period to take into account all of the science that's really out here in terms of the use of atrazine. Illinois is the largest user of atrazine in the country. So I think as producers, we have a lot at stake here in terms of the atrazine issue. So if you would, we'll collect those. If you have a chance to sign those, we'd be happy to collect them, and we'll send those back as we move forward. So speaking of who's elected, if you go over there to page 5 and you look a little bit there in the middle of the page on that slide, what's really at stake for agriculture as we look at this election? You see trade, we've talked about immigration, the regulatory arena, the 2018 Farm Bill, and probably one of the biggest issues, I think, is this next president will, at a minimum, most likely appoint 3 U.S. Supreme Court justices, possibly 4 in their tenure. That will have a long-term impact on this country, on us, on our kids, on anybody that lives here, because that court, and I just talked about a lot of issues that are in litigation, and that's going to continue. There's going to be more, and they're going to go to the highest court to be settled. And so whoever is in that chair as a president, whether they take a conservative approach or they take a liberal approach to those justices, is going to set the tone for how that court operates for the next several years, probably beyond many of our lifetimes. So it is a big deal. It's a huge deal. And it's one that, again, will impact us in agriculture. Trade, we've talked about enough. Regulation, I think we've talked about enough. Immigration is a big deal for us. We have a lot of workers involved, whether it's in specialty crop production, livestock production. This immigration issue has tremendous impact on us. If you look down there at the bottom of the page, it talks about the U.S. Senate and kind of what's the scenario as we think about the Senate. So you have currently 54 Republicans and 46 Democrats. The Republicans have to defend 23 seats. Half of those primarily are in Democratic, majority Democratic voting states, Illinois being one of those. So the Senate, the U.S. Senate, as you see on your sheet, that's not my prediction, but prediction from many of the people that I talked to in D.C. when we were out there a few weeks ago, is that it's going to be very difficult for the Republicans to maintain control of the Senate, given the scenario that they're up against. So if leadership in the Senate changes, that's going to have implications, again, to who's going to be in the White House. Is that going to be Trump or is that going to be Miss Clinton? Again, control of the Senate becomes a big issue. So that's one that, again, we're watching very closely, but it certainly would look like the Democrats would probably, at this point in time anyway, have the upper hand there. On the back page, you see the U.S. House of Representatives scenario. So you have 247 Republican and 188 Democrats. Democrats would have to win 30 seats to retain control. Not anticipated that that's going to happen, but what is anticipated is the margin will probably shrink a little bit, which would give folks like the Freedom Caucus a bigger voice. And if you have watched at all the struggles that Speaker Ryan has had in terms of kind of managing this caucus and managing issues like the 2018 Farm Bill that I talked about earlier, it puts extra pressure, in my opinion, on that chamber to be able to kind of find agreement in moving legislation. The rural and urban members are listed down there that I mentioned earlier, 34 to 195. This is why we have the battle that we have on things like the Farm Bill and the SNAP program, and I don't see any of that changing. One thing we do on the state level that I wish we could do more of on the federal level, I wish our counterparts would do more of, we have a program called Adopt a Legislator on the state level. Probably the best thing Illinois Farm Bureau ever did several years ago, where we take the legislators in the 5-county area around Chicago, which is 75% of the General Assembly resides in that 5-county area.